Racism is not based on some empirical generalization. It is based rather on an ontological affirmation. It is not the assertion that certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. It is the affirmation that the very being of a people is inferior, and that is the great tragedy of it. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. All right. Welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. You're tuning in live. I especially thank you for giving me your time so early. And I do apologize for the tardiness. Just some show prep this morning that I just couldn't get done by 7 a.m. So I had to kind of push things back a little bit. No worries. The show must go on. It will go on. We are here now. So, what do I want to talk about? Let's dive right into this. Let's not waste any time here, right, folks? So, let me pull up this. So again, I'm talking about Mark Cuban, sort of. This the That's where we're Mark Cuban. If you saw my episode on DEI, canceled. I think it was like canceled DEI, something like that. At any rate, he has been going on and on and on about DEI and how it's wonderful and it's great. And it's really just a way to improve your business. And I disagreed with him on that, but he's still going on that. And he is talking about it and having these conversations with people, which I think is good. I can appreciate the fact that he's willing to have the conversations. I'm not sure that I believe that he's really being as open as he needs to be in order to look at this situation clearly. So we're going to start by showing you this clip here, or not this clip, but I mean this tweet here that he put out. And he says, I would love to hear from everyone who is currently employed what objective measure of metric was used to determine you were the most qualified applicant when you were hired. And of course, if you could also mention the position you were hired for, that would help. Thanks in advance. Now, what is he asking us for? The whole issue that people are arguing, they're saying, hey, meritocracy is the way to go. DEI usurps meritocracy. And Mark is kind of like trying to say, like, there's this way of getting DEI and meritocracy together. Like they can blend together. And other people are like pointing out, like, no, actually, that is in fact not the case. So then Scott Adams jumps in on this and he said, I respect your efforts to get up to speed on this critical topic. Your blind spot is because white employees know they will end their careers if they are honest about their experiences. I don't think employers can easily discern who would perform better. That's why they don't consider white applicants. Their bonuses depend on increasing diversity. In banking, I was finishing my MBA on top of my economics degree and was told they had to promote a woman with a high school degree over me because I am white and male. Same story when I moved to Pacific Bell. My bosses told me directly, no guessing on my part. This is normal in all big American companies. I'm glad you are digging in. You'll be flabbergasted. So then Mark Cuban retweets that and he says, despite all of this, Scott, white men, the demographic demo you feel has gotten passed over, make more money and have lower employment rates than the black people and women you feel are replacing them. How do you reconcile this? And he pulls up two charts. Now I'm going to pull up those two charts for you. And there we are. So these are charts that basically just show over on the left, you have the unemployment rate over the last 20 years for Black or African American men. And then on the right, you have the unemployment rate for the last 20 years for white males. And he shows these and he's like, look, how are you reconciling this difference? And Scott's reply was not so pleasant. He basically said something to the effect of, well, I thought you were here to ask serious questions. I guess you're not. And like he's like, end of discussion. Now, I'm not going to spend the time here talking about the unemployment rates so much. What I want to talk about instead is how social justice has brought us to this point. Now, you can argue what we need to do, but I think before you argue what we need to do, we kind of need to take a little look at history. So I got some media clips here. One of them is quite long and there was just no way around it. But I think you're going to find it a very valuable add to your morning or whenever you're listening to this. So, what I want to talk about instead of the employment rates is how do we get to the position where we have a lot of unemployment? What's going on? Why are we even in a position to need, if we will, to help minority groups, right? Because that's really the big question. And I think history has some things to tell us. If you've watched my show at any length of time, you know that I am a huge fan of Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams. Now, the actual racist out there would say, well, that's because you're just finding Black people that agree with you. And that's really sad on their part that they would think that I could not be instructed by a Black person, which is exactly why I'm a fan of them. Because when I started reading them, I was like, man, these guys are brilliant. And they painstakingly, over decades, have dug into the data. And then they have painstakingly spent time writing and, in some cases, doing some interviews where they explain this data in super simple concepts. Like, so it's like it's not hard to understand. So my my fanboy, if you will, of these two men is because I wish that I could be half as brilliant as either one of them, right? Like this is not me just picking out two guys that that make my world that that satisfy my worldview. This is not me finding the token Black people. This is me saying, man, these guys are brilliant and they have done a lot of work and they have researched this kind of thing for decades, right? Like if you can find videos of both of these men in like the 70s when you had like the standard 70s look, right? The videos are out there with the Technicolor and all that. And they're saying some of the same things that they're saying now. And they researched back then and found this information. And so they came to a different conclusion. So I think the issue is education. I think that is a big deal. Now, that's the reason why I chose the quote that I did today. Usually the quote matches something to do with the show, but not always. In this case, it absolutely does. So, again, to read that quote, and let me put it back up on the screen just so you can see it if you're watching. Racism is not based on some empirical generalization, is based rather on an ontological affirmation. It is not. I think that's this is the very important part. It is not racism is not the assertion that certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. It racism is the affirmation that the very being of a people is inferior, and that is the great tragedy of it. And I think what we need to start realizing is we can look and say a group of people, minorities, in this particular case, we're talking about the Black community, are behind because of what? Well, they're behind culturally and they're behind otherwise, right? Like Dr. King says, well, they're behind in their not unemployment, but in employment and other things. And so then a lot of people want to correct it and they say, well, we need to do all these things. And I think that those things are causing the problem. So let me play my first really quick clip here, and this one comes from Walter Williams, and this is from a biography that I'm trying to think of what it's called. Suffer No Fools. It was a biography called Suffer No Fools. I will put all the links to everything in the show notes. So I want you to hear what he has to say. Now, this man, I don't recall when he was born, but I know he died a few years ago, like 3 or 4 years ago, and he was like 83 or something like that. So he's lived a nice, long, healthy life. And his life actually overlaps the civil rights movement. So one of the things that I like about them is not so much that they're Black and they say things that I like to hear because it's not entirely true at all. It's that they've researched this, but also they live through the experience, right? So they're not just like some new young person who maybe doesn't have the experience of the civil rights movement to to add to and to take what they're learning and put it into a different perspective, right? No, they had that. Both of these men had that. So here's this video. Let's see what he says.
At UCLA, they gave me inspiration to think with my brain instead of my heart. That was probably maybe the beginning of my switching from one kind of radical to another.
So when he says one kind of radical to another, I believe what he means is he started out as more of a Dr. Martin Luther King type radical and moved over to more of a I can see his face and I'm drawing a blank on his name. And I'm sure that everybody that's watching knows it. Malcolm X. He's more of a Malcolm X type radical. And I believe he actually said that somewhere. I'm quite certain that I heard him say that. Unfortunately, I don't know where that clip is to verify.
With a head full of new ideas, Walter accepts a full-time assistant professorship from Cal State's economics department. A long way from the Philadelphia projects.
I often tell people that I am very, very happy that I got virtually all of my education before it became fashionable for white people to like black people. So what that meant is that when I got a C, it was an honest to God C. When I got an A, it was an honest to God A. They weren't practicing affirmative action and they didn't give a damn about my self-esteem.
All right. So I think this is kind of the core of what's going on. We've got couple generations of people who have found it fashionable to like black people, which sounds kind of in a way bad, like DL. We should like black people. We should like all people, right? Just in general. And then maybe there are certain individuals that we don't like based on their behavior. Totally agree. But I think when he says fashionable to like black people, it's not genuine. It's become what you might call a virtue signaling. Hey, look what I'm doing for this community. So you're not really trying to help people. You're trying to help yourself. You're trying to make yourself look good among your peers. And in doing so, you actually harm the people that you claim that you're helping. And there's plenty of data. If you read either one of these two men, they will give you plenty of data. They're very critical of some of the legislation that was passed during the civil rights movement, simply because they believe that what it did was it started that path of changing people from being behind in one way to being behind in another way. And again, we're talking about the Black community largely, but it affects other communities as well. And their argument is that it basically, one of the largest things that happened was that it broke up the Black homes. And so they go back and they look and they say, okay, well, if you go back to the time of slavery, shortly after slavery, all the way up, or after slavery, all the way up through right before the civil rights movement, you see an intact Black family, two-parent homes. And then after that, you start seeing a downward trend, a sharp downward trend where Black homes are less and less and less very quickly, two-parent homes. And they point out, like, I think it's Walter Williams who said that what did he say? I think he said the Civil Rights Act did what slavery couldn't do, which was destroy the Black family. So we're getting back to education here, because one of the big things that we talk about in society is like, hey, we got to have education and we got to put more money into it. And we've got to do all these things because otherwise people can't get a good education. And when they can't get a good education, they're going to struggle on the job market. I agree with the fact that, yes, if you don't have a good education when it comes to the job market, you are going to struggle. Yesterday, I walked through we watched Javier Malay's speech, and he's talking about how the free market is the best opportunity to bring people up in general. And he goes through all this data and he's comparing once upon a time Argentina to present day Argentina and the policies that led to present day where they're basically in poverty. The problem, and if you want to call it a problem, maybe we can put that in quotation marks. The problem with the free market is that it's brutal. It is unforgiving, right? That is the one problem. However, on the other hand, that's a good thing because when you're I believe that humans in general, it doesn't matter what skin color you are, they are, we have been designed in a sense. If you believe in a creator, then it's designed. If you don't believe in a creator, then years of evolution, one way or another, we have been designed to face and overcome adversity. And I think when we start moving away from adversity, then it becomes a detriment to us. Now, you might say, DL, are you suggesting that we go back to racist days? Not at all. Absolutely not. What I am saying is that we should go back to a more free market days. And with the current environment that we have now, where it's actually not acceptable to be a racist, it was acceptable once upon a time, would allow different communities to rise up in the same way that we're seeing Javier Milei say, "Hey, you know what? We need this so that Argentina can get back to being prosperous and wealthy again." And I believe the same thing applies to pockets of or groups of people, even within a developed nation that is doing fairly well, like the U.S. compared to some of these other countries. We are doing well. We have our problems that we need to deal with, and they are significant issues. But compared to like Argentina, we're in much better shape. But that doesn't mean that everyone is in much better shape. So, how do I reconcile the idea that the free market will help? Well, I think we have to go back and look at some history. So, I have often talked about something called the M Street School. Now, if you're not familiar with it, I've got an audio video clip from Thomas Sowell. It's actually not him speaking. It's his audiobook, uh, Black Rednecks and White Liberal. I think it's Black Rednecks, White Liberals. And it's about a 12-minute clip. So I'm going to play it. I'll probably make some commentary along the way just to kind of break it up a little bit. But I want you to hear historically what he, I want you to just see historically what the Black community was actually capable of during a time when it was definitely not fashionable in any way for white people to like Black people. In fact, you could say it was the other way around and not for virtue. Like people literally did not like Black people, or they had some reservation, right? Maybe they didn't just hate them, in the 1960s type of way, but maybe they had some reservation, right? They still had some bigotry going on, right? But maybe it wasn't quite the level that we all have seen with attack dogs and the police and things like that from the 1960s. But it was still not a good time in terms of, so like there was a very distinct Black people, white people, you stayed at your own, we stayed at our own. And at that time, if you hated Black people, nobody thought twice. You would never lose your job for it, right? Like it would be acceptable. You could be a very successful person despite that, right? And maybe in some ways it would have helped you. So we're not talking about we're not talking about a time when race issues were not a problem. We are actually talking about a time when they were an issue. So let's play this clip and let's just see exactly what it is that, and I'll explore a few other things, but let's just go and see what he has to say about this M Street School.
In 1899, there were 4 academic public high schools in Washington, D.C., 1 Black and 3 white. In standardized tests given that year, students in the Black high school averaged higher test scores than students in 2 of the 3 white high schools. Today, more than a century later, it would be considered utopian even to set that as a goal, much less expect it to actually happen. Yet what happened back in 1899 was no isolated fluke. That same school repeatedly equaled or exceeded national norms on standardized tests in the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s.
Okay, so point out here, this school, 1930s, 40s, 50s, right? So we got a 30-year span. They're performing exceptionally well. This is before the 1960s, before we had a lot of legislation that said, hey, we need to make some changes legislatively.
Back in the 1890s, it was called the M Street School, and in 1916, it was renamed Dunbar High School. When this information on Dunbar High School was first published in the 1970s, those few educators who responded at all dismissed the relevance of these findings by saying that these were middle-class children, and therefore their experience was not relevant to the education of low-income minority children.
Are you still interested in a solar-powered generator?
Oh
These
man,
special
I'm so
assessments,
sorry,
I wanna
folks.
Do something that until recently we've never done. I'm going to offer this.
Let me see if I can't scoot past this. I did not realize I caught that in there.
Have to risk.
All right.
It so happens
Sorry
that there
about
was
that, folks.
evidence on the occupations of the parents of the children at this school as far back as the early 1890s. As of academic year 1892-93, of the known occupations of these parents, there were 51 laborers, 25 messengers, 12 janitors, and 1 doctor. That hardly
So I want to point out here, he starts out by saying like, hey, these educators, when we presented this this information and said, hey, look what's going on, they just simply dismissed it. They didn't even bother looking, and they just said, oh, well, probably a bunch of middle-class black folk. That's really what he did. That, they're just middle class. Isn't that weird? Because that's kind of what happens today. People dismiss something and they just assume that if somebody's doing well, they must be middle class. They must be upper class. Like nobody could possibly do well that comes from a poor community or from a poor household. I mean, think about some of the conversations that you hear about school. Hey, we got to feed these kids because if we don't feed them, well, they'll go to school hungry and they just won't be able to get an education. Oh, interesting. Seems like historically that was not the case.
seems middle class. Over the years, a significant black middle class did develop in Washington, and most of them may well have sent their children to the M Street School, or to Dunbar High School, as it was later called. But that is wholly different from saying that most of the children at that school came from middle-class homes. More detailed data on parental occupations are available for a later period, from the late 1930s through the mid-1950s. These data reveal that there were far more children whose mothers were maids than there were whose fathers were doctors. Mary Gibson Hundley, who taught at Dunbar for many years, wrote, "A large segment of the homes of the students had one or more government employees for support. Before the 1940s, these employees were messengers and clerks, with few exceptions." It is possible, of course, to redefine middle class in relative terms for the black community as it existed at that time, but such verbal dexterity serves only to salvage words at the expense of reality. The parents of Dunbar students may or may not have been a random sample of the black parents of their time, either occupationally or in terms of their aspirations for their children. But neither were most of them people with professional careers or levels of income that would be considered middle class by the standards of American society as a whole. Intellectual or academic achievements for blacks, as for everyone else, no doubt have preconditions, but the crucial question is whether these are economic preconditions, as so widely asserted, and so widely assumed to be insuperable barriers to good education for minority children from low-income families. A related stereotype is that the children who went to Dunbar High School were the light-skinned descendants of the black elite that derived from miscegenation during the era of slavery. Here again, the facts have been readily available and widely ignored.
So think about that for a minute. Like people want to give you every excuse, but the fact that maybe people could excel. So I find that disgusting. It's disgusting that somebody would leap to make all kind of illogical arguments without at least looking at the data to say, oh, what does the data say? Right? Oh, well, they're just light-skinned people. Oh, okay. So think about what you're saying. If you're the kind of person who is saying, well, they were middle class or they were light-skinned, then you're the kind of person that is willing to say that if you're poor, if you're lower class, and if you're dark skinned, you can't make it. That is exactly what somebody is saying. And it is disgusting.
Photographs and old yearbooks from the era of Dunbar's academic success show no such preponderance of light-skinned blacks. Here again, there is a fundamental difference between saying that certain types of people were more likely to send their children to Dunbar, or that such children were overrepresented, and saying that most of the children who went to Dunbar came from such families. Whether in economic or other terms, the families from which the students of Dunbar High School came cannot be nearly so atypical as suggested by those who say that they were mostly Washington's growing black bourgeoisie. For many years, there was only one academic high school for blacks in the District of Columbia, and as late as 1948, 1/3 of all black youngsters attending high school in Washington attended Dunbar High School. If we took only the children of doctors and lawyers, a former Dunbar principal asked, how could we have had 1,400 black students at one time?
Mm.
This was not a selective school in the sense in which we normally use that term. It was not necessary to take tests to get in, for example, even though there was undoubtedly self-selection in the sense that students who were serious went to Dunbar, and those who were not had other places where they could while away their time without having to meet high academic standards. A spot check of attendance records and tardiness records showed that the M Street School at the turn of the century and Dunbar High School at mid-century had less absenteeism and less tardiness than the white high schools in the District of Columbia at those times.
Now, this point is going to be valuable in just a moment as Dr. Soul starts retelling some of the achievements that have come out of M Street School. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind that compared to their white counterparts, they had less absenteeism in their schools, right? Like the kids seem to have taken it seriously, whether it was the kids that did it or whether it was the parents that kind of imposed it, probably mostly the latter. But I would imagine that the kids probably took it serious to some degree as well.
In the 19th century, tardiness had at first been a problem, but it was a problem that was apparently not tolerated. The school had a tradition of being serious, going back to its founders and early principals, who reflected the influence of the New England culture, which contrasted so much with that of the culture of most blacks. Among those early principals was the first black woman to receive a college degree in the United States, Mary Jane Patterson from Oberlin College, class of 1862. At that time, Oberlin had different academic curriculum requirements for women and men. Latin, Greek, and mathematics were required in the gentleman's course, as it was called, but not in the curriculum for ladies. Miss Patterson, however, insisted on taking Latin, Greek, and mathematics anyway. We can only imagine what fortitude and sense of purpose that must have taken at a time when no black woman had ever gotten a college degree in the entire history of the country, and when most members of her race were still slaves in the South. Not surprisingly, in her later 12 years as principal of the Black High School in Washington during its formative period, Mary Jane Patterson was noted for a strong, forceful personality, for thoroughness, and for being an indefatigable worker. Having this kind of person shaping the standards and traditions of the school in its early years undoubtedly had something to do with its later success. Other early principals included the first black man to graduate from Harvard, class of 1870.
All right, so here we're getting into some of the outcomes of this school. So pay pay very close attention to what these students went on to achieve.
3 of the school's first 10 principals had graduated from Oberlin, 2 from Harvard, and 1 each from Amherst and Dartmouth. Because of restricted academic opportunities for blacks, Dunbar could get teachers with very high qualifications, and even had PhDs among its teachers in the 1920s. Mary Gibson Hunley pointed out in her history of Dunbar High School.
Getting into college
Oh my
is
goodness.
from
This explains why the video was a lot longer than I thought it would be. I was editing and I was like, why is this video 15 minutes?
Federal standards providing equal salaries for all teachers, regardless of sex or race, attracted to Washington the best-trained colored college graduates from Northern and Western colleges in the early days, and later from local colleges as well. One of the other educational dogmas of our times is the notion that standardized tests do not predict future performances for minority children, either in academic institutions or in life. Innumerable scholarly studies have devastated this claim intellectually, though it still survives and flourishes politically.
Now, why would that survive politically? Why would it? Well, because a lot of people are just willing to dismiss information, as pointed out by Dr. Soul a few moments ago, when people were like, "Oh, why did we have all of these, black students doing so well?" Must have been because they were the middle class ones. They were the bourgeois ones, right? They were the bougie blacks. So, of course, they did well. Or, oh, wait a minute. These were the white ones, what we might term today as passing, right? Oh, you're light skinned. Therefore, I don't dislike you as much. So, therefore, you did better. Again, what we're doing is we're saying this group of people is it is the group of people that can't possibly make it, right? Like there's no way for them to make it without my help. Talk about punching down.
But the history of this black high school in Washington likewise shows a payoff for solid academic preparation and the test scores that result from it. Over the entire 85-year history of academic success in this school, from 1870 to 1955, most of its graduates went on to higher education. This was very unusual for either black or white high school graduates during that era. Because these were usually low-income students, most went to a local free teachers' college or to relatively inexpensive Howard University. But significant numbers won scholarships to leading colleges and universities elsewhere. Early in the 20th century, some M Street School graduates began going to Harvard, the first in 1903, and other academically elite colleges. A French educator who visited the M Street School that year described its students as pursuing the same studies as our average college student. During the period from 1918 to 1923, graduates of this school went on to earn 25 degrees from Ivy League colleges, Amherst, Williams, and Wellesley. At one time during this era, there were 9 black students at Amherst, 6 from Dunbar High School. Over the period from 1892 to 1954, Amherst admitted 34 graduates of the M Street School and Dunbar. Of these, 74% graduated from Amherst, and 28% of these graduates were Phi Beta Kappas. Nor was Amherst unique. Dunbar graduates also became Phi Beta Kappas at Harvard, Yale, Williams, Cornell, Dartmouth, and other elite institutions. At one time, the reputation of Dunbar graduates was such that they did not have to take entrance examinations to be admitted to Dartmouth, Harvard, and some other selective colleges.
I mean, think about that. Is that amazing or what? Like the reputation, like, oh, you graduated from this school? You know what? You don't even need to take a test because we know the level of the quality of intelligence and knowledge that you are coming in with. We don't even need to check. We know what it is. And remember a moment ago when he was talking about like the rates of attendance, right, were much higher than the white counterparts. Like when a group of people put in the work, they can succeed. And I think this is the point that we need to recognize is like we keep helping people and we're hurting them. All right, let's continue on.
When Robert N. Mattingly graduated from the M Street School in 1902, he entered Amherst College, receiving credit for freshman mathematics and first-year college physics. And he graduated in 3 years, Phi Beta Kappa. Yet, far from being one of the elite, Mattingly was, in his own words, at Amherst on a shoestring. No systematic study has been made of the later careers of the graduates of M Street and Dunbar High School. However, when black educator Horace Mann Bond studied the backgrounds of blacks with PhDs in 1970, he discovered that more of them had graduated from M Street Dunbar than from any other black high school in the country. The first black who pioneered in a number of fields also came from this school.
This is great stuff here.
The first black man to graduate from Annapolis came from Dunbar. The first black enlisted man in the Army to rise to become a commissioned officer also came from this same institution. So did the first black woman to receive a PhD from an American university. So did the first black full professor at a major American university, Allison Davis at the University of Chicago. So did the first black federal judge, the first Black general, the first Black cabinet member, the first Black senator elected since Reconstruction, and, among other notables, the doctor who pioneered the use of blood plasma, historian Carter G. Woodson, author and poet Sterling Brown, and Duke Ellington, who studied music at Dunbar. During World War II, when Black military officers were rare, there were among this school's graduates many captains and lieutenants, nearly a score of majors, 9 colonels and lieutenant colonels, and 1 brigadier general. All this contradicts another widely believed notion that schools do not make much difference in children's academic or career success because income and family background are much larger influences. If the schools do not differ very much from one another, then of course it will not make much difference which one a child attends. But when they differ dramatically, the results can also differ dramatically. This was not the only school to achieve success with minority children. But before turning to other examples, it may be useful to consider why and how this 85-year history of dramatic success was abruptly turned into all too typical failure, virtually overnight, by the politics of education.
All right. So when we look historically, we look at an 85-year period where Dunbar consistently produced quality graduate students, right? Like they went on to become all sorts of first. They went on to have many great further educational success, graduating from a number of elite institutions. In some cases, they weren't even when it was found out, when it was determined, like, oh, you came from Dunbar or you came from M Street School. Well, we're not even going to test you because we don't even need to know, right? And then we've got people that are entering in college, and they're entering in college. I can't remember the person that he was talking about. I can't remember his specific name, but the gentleman who went into college and said that he was on a shoestring. In other words, like I'm actually not, I'm barely hanging on here. And he went in he came in with credits in like physics and some other classes. He was doing better than many kids going into college today, white and Black. He was far more advanced intellectually and with an education than kids going in today. Why is that? How is it that in a time when it was acceptable to be racist, when it was acceptable to separate people, when segregation was not even second guessed, how is it that a people managed to come out so successful consistently through this school? Well, I think it has to do with the free market. It has to do with Walter Williams, what he said early on, where he said, I am fortunate that I got all my education before it became fashionable for white people to like Black people. And when he says it's fashionable, we're not talking about an honest to God, like, hey, I've got legitimate Black friends that I respect and that I really like. That's not fashionable. That's honest. That's earnest, right? The fashionable is pretending to like Black people so that you look good among your peers, pretending to do things so that your peers will basically give you the intellectual version of the high five in the locker room. That is what's harming people. We need to go back to a time of meritocracy because meritocracy works. It worked for Argentina and it worked for the Black community, even when racial tensions were in a place that they really shouldn't have been. Now, let's continue on with some more information because I want to flood you with as much information as I possibly can in about an hour. So let me move over to, let's see, where is this here? We'll close that out. And then let me read you some excerpts from Booker T. Washington's book, Up from Slavery. Now, Booker T. Washington wrote this in, I believe, 1901. Okay, so it's an autobiography in a sense, and he's talking about his experience. So let me read this to you so that you can kind of get, now again, we're talking about 1901, and he's actually writing about history. So, and he's writing about his experience that he had lived. So this is actually not in the time of 1901. This is actually prior to 1900. So here's the excerpt that comes from chapter 10 of his book, Up from Slavery. He says, the making of these bricks. Now, to give you a sense of what's going on, he's telling this story about how he opened a school and he wanted to educate the Black community. And in order to do that, they basically had to do everything themselves. They even had to build their own school. In order to build their own school, they had to create their own bricks because they had no money, so they couldn't buy bricks. And their first few attempts to make a kiln to heat and cook the bricks failed like 3 times. And I think it was the 4th try. And he ended up selling like a watch, like a watch that he got from his family, in order to try it one more time, and they finally got it. So he said, the making of these bricks taught me an important lesson in regard to the relations of the 2 races in the South. Many white people who had no contact with the school and perhaps no sympathy with it came to us to buy bricks because they found out that ours were good bricks. Now, remember what I said yesterday when I said, if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. This is the free market at play. The free market can be brutal, but it can be very rewarding. Continuing on, they discovered that we were supplying a real want in the community. The making of these bricks caused many of the white residents of the neighborhood to begin to feel that the education of the Negro was not making him worthless, but that in educating our students, we are adding something to the wealth and comfort of the community. As the people of the neighborhood came to us to buy bricks, we got acquainted with them, they traded with us, and we with them. Our business interest become intermingled. Now, you may have heard this saying that when goods don't cross borders, armies do. I need to figure out a way to say it to apply to communities, right? So when goods cross the borders of racial communities or different demographics, hostilities don't. I'm gonna work on that, but it's the same concept. When people are trading with each other, when you have something I want, all of a sudden I have to check whatever biases and prejudices that I have, at least enough to make the trade, if not more. All right, let's continue on. Our business interests became intermingled. We had something which they wanted. They had something which we wanted. This, in large measure, helped to lay the foundation for the pleasant relations that have continued to exist between us and the white people in that section and which now extend throughout the South. Now, again, we're not suggesting that, I'm not suggesting that things were super great for the Black community in the 1900s. They still weren't. However, we are seeing that when we allow the free market to take place, which relies on meritocracy, then people's lives get better because they excel and the people around them notice it. The people around them say, wow, you're doing something in this community that I value. Let's continue on with the rest of what I have here. There's the rest of this clip from Up from Slavery. Wherever one of our brick makers has gone in the South, we find that he has something to contribute to the well-being of the community into which he has gone, something that has made the community feel that in a degree, it is indebted to him and perhaps to a certain extent dependent upon him. In other words, listen, he said, when one of our brick makers went to another community, they felt dependent on him. In this way, pleasant relations between the races have been stimulated, not perfected, stimulated, right? So bricks, the making of bricks did more to resolve race relations than most, if not all, of the legislation in the 1960s. My experience is that there is something in human nature which always makes an individual recognize and reward merit. There we go again, that word merit. No matter under what color of skin merit is found. I have found too that it is the visible, the tangible, that goes a long way in softening prejudices. The actual sight of a first-class house that a Negro has built is 10 times more potent than pages of discussion about a house that he ought to build or perhaps could build. In other words, when you deliver, people respond. People respond to incentives. That is what I believe is causing this. When we go back and we look at when Mark Cuban says, well, what do you make of these differences? What do you make of the fact that the unemployment rate for the Black community is higher than for the white community? I think, yeah, I think those charts were specifically Black males and white males. What do you make of these differences? Well, what I make of it, Mark, is that people keep trying to help and they're getting in the way of other people showing the community what they can deliver. Now, one more example here. Let me see. Do I have it up on? Am I going to pull it up on the screen? I don't think I'm going to pull it up on the screen, but I will talk about it. Black Wall Street. You ever heard of it? Black Wall Street was a section in Tulsa, Oklahoma that was known for being one of the wealthiest communities, Black communities in the United States. Black Wall Street existed between 1905 and 1921. Unfortunately, white folk got all upset over something that I think did not happen, and they went berserk, lost their damn minds, and went over and basically burned down the town and killed people. It was a disaster. Like there is no way to explain the disaster, the Tulsa race massacre, other than anything than the absolute worst that white people have to offer. Period. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the time between 1905 to 1921. It doesn't get a lot of conversation. How is it that less than 20 years, in less than 20 years, an area became known as Black Wall Street, as a place where Black people were thriving, were doing very, very well in less than 20 years? Now, I want to ask you, because there's been a lot of conversation about the Civil Rights Act. And we're not going to get into whether or not we should have passed it and blah, blah. But let me just ask you a question. Civil Rights Act was passed in what, 1964? It's 2023. It's a lot more than 20 years. Why have we not seen a Black Wall Street? What happened? How is it that a Black Wall Street could arise in a time of segregation and acceptable racism, but cannot now? I think that when Dr. Soul and Dr. Williams talk about the legislation being actually harmful, I think they're onto something. When they both talk about how Black children are being robbed of an education because we're basically placating to the worst, right? We're not dealing with people our students in the way that we used to. Let me pull something up here really, really quickly. I just happened to come across this. I'm going to throw it in there just to kind of point this out. I don't know who this person is, but it's very, very interesting. So this comes from a man named Frank McCormick. Again, I don't know who he is. He says, I'll never forget when my principal asked me to reflect on why most of the students sent to the office were Black. And I told her it's because they misbehave more. You could actually watch her have an aneurysm in real time. Not because she thought I was racist, but because she didn't know how to respond to a teacher being truthful on the issue. They use language like reflect to have you engage in some sort of pseudo psychological struggle session where you discuss your own intrinsic biases and how you'll do better. But ultimately, it's an implied threat. Change your behavior or lose your job. What 99% of teachers do is simply stop referring Black students to the office. What does that mean? They're still in the class now. This emboldens them and their behavior becomes worse. Everyone notices, including the students, but no one says a thing. It's Orwellian. It got so bad that we literally had Black students walking around the halls during class doing whatever the hell they wanted. Security and administration would just shadow them and ask them to talk politely 2,000 times. The kids would just keep walking while mumbling, F this N-word. We're not going to say it. No need to mess up a good flow here. Mumble, and so on. It increased racial resentment from other students and staff members. And the increased visibility of this behavior just reinforced stereotypes. These are the kids that become the adults in society that get in standoffs with police over minor compliance issues, get shot, and become civil rights martyrs. Schools are creating walking powder kegs that blow up. Society is collateral. Now, then he posts something here, and I'll put that up on full screen here so that you can see it. Let's see if we got that there. All right, so here it is. And so it's just a screenshot of several headlines: challenging the school to prison pipeline. The Black Mothers Forum advocacy for Black students. We need change. Black students at Saline High School high call for stricter response to racism. Black students in North Carolina get suspended at higher rates, study says. Portland teachers contract could tackle disproportionate discipline against students of color. So what in the world is going on here? I'll tell you what's going on. We're not adhering to the standards that they did in the Dunbar High School, the M Street schools back in the day. Those schools and the schools that were erected by Booker T. Washington were extremely strict. If you read up from slavery, you're going to find that they were way stricter than they are today, like light years stricter. It's insane. They removed students who were not contributing to getting an education, and they held the standards for all of them. When you remove students who are causing a problem, what happens? That student is no longer disrupting the other students who aren't causing a problem, who would actually like to get an education and go on to be something successful. We are harming people by coddling them. And we're not coddling them even in a good way. We're not saying, hey, I totally get it. This person was rude to you. We're going to do something about it. We're coddling them in a negative way that disrupts their ability to show merit. The free market, the entity, I don't want to call it an entity, the free market can deliver prosperity to people. We've seen it over and over and over. We've seen it in huge nations. We've seen it in pockets of people. And we see it when the times would suggest otherwise. Black Wall Street, nobody, if you had never heard of Black Wall Street and you only knew about the Robin DiAngelos of today, white supremacy and white fragility and all these ideas, if that's all you knew, and someone said, hey, in the 1900s, do you suppose that in less than 20 years, somebody could go from buying 40 acres, which I believe is how many acres that the man bought in Tulsa, buy 40 acres and make an explicit community for Black people? Do you suppose that it could go on to become so successful that it's literally called Black Wall Street? I'm willing to bet that virtually everybody would say, absolutely not. There's no way. Like, racism was so bad back then, it would keep everybody down. Or if you said, hey, back in the 1800s, back in the 1900s, do you suppose that a school could be put together that was consistently underfunded and still deliver PhD after PhD after PhD for minority students who came from humble homes where the parents were not doctors, but maybe they were just standard laborers? Do you suppose that could happen? No. The answer is going to totally be no. Why? Because people don't understand the value, the benefit of meritocracy. We need to get back to meritocracy and allow the free market to do its thing, because the free market doesn't care what color you are. And we have ample evidence to support this. Now, I want to point out one more thing. I don't have any actual, let's see, where did it go here? Oh, did I not bring it in? I didn't bring it in, so I'll just tell you about it instead of showing it to you. And that'll be sufficient. We need to get going with the end of this episode anyway. In a 2000 book, a man that I love reading, John McWhorter, he's an American linguist. He's also a Black man. He's an American linguist and political commentator. He wrote a book called Losing the Race: Self-Sabotage in Black America. Okay, he wrote this in 2000. Now, he is a linguist and he taught at various prestigious schools. And so this book, here's the description from Wikipedia, just so you understand what he wrote about. He said, he argues that some elements of Black culture are more responsible than external racial prejudice and discrimination for the social problems faced by Black Americans several decades after the Civil Rights Movement. Specifically, McWhorter points to anti-intellectualism, separatism, and self-perpetuated identity of victimhood as factors limiting them as a group. I want you to go back and think about at the very beginning of this episode, the quote that I gave, that racism is not the assertion that certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. In other words, he is describing an environmental condition. This is a condition that can be changed. This is a condition that did not exist among the Black community prior to the Civil Rights Act, back when we were seeing the Black Wall Streets and the M Street schools deliver. This was not there. He tells two interesting stories in the book because I actually read the book. I just don't happen to have it handy to give you these citations. But I'll link to it on Amazon so you can go and read it yourself. I encourage you to read it. So he tells two stories. Number one, when he was a young lad, he was interested in language and studying and whatnot. And he tells a story about how he had said something kind of smart, and some of his friends slapped him. They literally slapped him, and they basically they discouraged him from learning and educating because that's not what we do. And I'm doing a very injustice to his story, so I apologize for that. But that's the story that he told that he personally experienced. And then he tells another story where he is teaching in college and he has Black students come in. They see that they have Black teacher and they start asking for favors. And they say, "Hey, brother, could you help me out by giving me a little time, a little extra time on this?" And he tells the story how he had Black students who thought, because I'm Black, therefore we have this shared bond, that I'm going to go easy on them, that I'm going to make it a little. And he said, "No, I'm not going to do that." And I believe in that same book, he has also made the argument that that this was unfortunately all too common, that people would give a little bit of flexibility because they were Black, and that this is actually harmful. And this is one of the reasons why we see so many Black students who have been admitted to colleges who then fail out, which is another thing that Thomas Sowell has pointed out. He said, when you don't get a good education in high school, and then you get some sort of preference in some way, however it looks, to college, you are being sent to a college for which you were ill prepared for. That is a disservice. Maybe you could have made it, but you can't because you were not prepared for the challenges that were facing you. But I'm willing to bet that if you took any student from M Street School and you plopped them into an Ivy League school today, they would absolutely be prepared. Why? Because it was driven on meritocracy. You need to deliver results. That's what's important. So, last thing, really quickly, because you might say, "Well, DL, you're just pointing out a bunch of Black guys that all agree with you." Well, not necessarily. Actually, not at all. Because again, these men, they enlightened me. I actually had more conservative views in different ways, and then I came to reading these gentlemen, and I was like, "Wow, these guys are brilliant, and they're coming with facts and data, and they're illustrating it through stories of their own experience." And here's the other thing: Walter Williams, Thomas Sowell, they're more of the libertarian-ish side, right? But John McWhorter, not at all. He describes himself as like a cantankerous Democrat or something like that, right? So he doesn't identify as the libertarian, more conservative strain, whereas the other two, they kind of do. They tend to avoid labels, but they're politically opposite, and they came to the same conclusion, a conclusion that is backed by history. So that is my show today, folks. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope the wait was well worth it. I'm again apologize that that I started the show at 7:30. I was trying to compile this together and get it all right so that the show would be worth your time. So I hope you found it informative and inspiring. I want you to catch me weekdays, 7 a.m. for an informed discussion on politics and culture. Then again, find me Sunday nights at 7 p.m., where I bring on my co host, Susan Hogarth. We discuss LP happenings. And in that, we look across the vastness of tyranny that's across this United States, and we see what is going on in the Libertarian Party that can get you excited or maybe get you inspired to do some of these same things in your community. Be sure that you are subscribed to either my YouTube channel or my Rumble channel. You can find those at youtube.libertydad.com or rumble.libertydad.com. And while you're there, drop me a comment. Let me know how I'm doing. Lastly, I want you to remember that if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. For now, catch you next time because I'm out.